Let my mom go, and I will make you walk again.
9-year-old Grace Whitfield stood in the center aisle of a packed courtroom, her small voice cutting through the silence as she looked directly at the judge seated behind the bench. "Let my mom go," she said, "and I'll make you walk again." The words landed strangely in a room built for procedure and precedent. A room where children were supposed to sit quietly in the gallery beside whichever relative had been trusted to keep them calm, not stand alone in the center aisle making promises that defied everything anyone in that building understood. About medicine, about law, about the ordinary limits of what a 9-year-old girl could possibly offer a man who had not felt his own legs in 11 years. Laughter rippled through the gallery first, sharp and dismissive, the kind of laughter adults save for children who don't yet understand how the world actually works, followed almost immediately by the low murmur of people turning to whisper to the person seated beside them, the particular sound of an audience recalibrating what kind of moment they were witnessing. Somewhere near the back, a bailiff shifted his weight, uncertain whether this fell under the category of disruption requiring intervention or simply a family's grief spilling somewhere it shouldn't. Grace did not flinch at any of it. She kept her eyes fixed on the bench, small hands balled into fists at her sides, the hem of her yellow dress slightly wrinkled from where she had been gripping it in the gallery, only moments before deciding, with the particular clarity children sometimes have, and adults have long since talked themselves out of, that sitting quietly was no longer something she was willing to do. Her mother, Diane Whitfield, sat at the defense table in a plain gray jumpsuit, her wrists cuffed in front of her eyes filled with a desperate mixture of love and fear as she twisted in her seat, straining against the restraint of both the handcuffs and her own attorney's hand on her arm, whispering her daughter's name with an urgency that cracked slightly in the middle. "Grace, please," she said. "Please sit down. Please don't do this for me." And there was something in her voice that suggested this fear was not only about the courtroom, not only about the verdict everyone in that room assumed was already decided, but about watching her daughter expose herself to public ridicule in a moment that could not possibly change anything. Diane had spent every day since her arrest trying to shield Grace from exactly this kind of moment, and here it was happening anyway, entirely because Grace herself had refused to be shielded any longer. The prosecutor at the opposing table, a composed man in his 40s who had built what he believed was an airtight case over the preceding months, allowed himself a small, tired smile, the expression of someone who has seen desperate families attempt every kind of theater in a courtroom and long ago stopped being moved by any of it. He did not object immediately. He seemed, if anything, almost amused, glancing sideways at his co-counsel with the particular expression of a man anticipating an easy dismissal that would only strengthen the impression of a defense with nothing left but a child's outburst to offer. The judge behind the bench, a man named Harrison Cole, seated in a wheelchair positioned carefully at the same height as where his elevated seat had once been before the accident that changed everything about how he occupied that room, studied the small girl in front of him for a long moment before responding. He had presided over hundreds of cases in the years since his own life had been permanently altered, had grown accustomed to the particular numbness of watching grief play out in front of him without allowing himself to feel much of it directly, a professional distance that had, somewhere along the way, hardened into something closer to genuine detachment. Something about the absolute certainty in this child's voice, the complete absence of performance in an outburst that should by every reasonable measure have looked exactly like performance, snagged at a part of him he had not felt activated in longer than he could easily recall. What none of them understood yet, not Judge Cole himself, not the prosecutor smiling faintly at what he assumed was easy theater, not even Diane, sitting cuffed and terrified at the defense table, was that the little girl standing in that aisle was about to unravel a conspiracy that reached far beyond one courtroom, one wrongful conviction, one grieving family desperately trying to hold itself together. Grace had come armed with nothing but a promise no one believed and a piece of information the entire investigation had somehow, whether by accident or design, completely missed. A detail that would, within the hour, force the court's outside counsel to request a review neither the prosecution nor the original investigators had ever anticipated needing to survive. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how Diane Whitfield ended up in handcuffs at a defense table with her 9-year-old daughter refusing to sit down, we have to understand what had been happening at Meridian Corp in the 18 months before her arrest. Diane had worked as a senior accountant there for 6 years, respected for the same quiet precision that would later become the very thing used to destroy her. She had noticed discrepancies in a handful of client accounts months before anyone accused her of anything. Money moving through channels that did not match the documentation she was given, and she had done exactly what a careful employee does. She asked questions. Those questions reached Victor Sloan, Meridian's chief executive, within days, and Sloan, a man who had spent a decade building an empire on exactly the kind of financial sleight of hand Diane had stumbled into, understood immediately that a competent accountant asking the right questions was a threat that needed to disappear, quietly and completely. The judge presiding over Diane's case, Harrison Cole, had not walked in 11 years, confined to a wheelchair since what everyone, including Cole himself, believed was a car accident. Prosecutor Marcus Reyes, standing confidently at his table that morning, had built the case against Diane using evidence he believed was solid, unaware of exactly how compromised his own information truly was. Grace, meanwhile, knew none of the financial details, only that her mother would never, in 100 lifetimes, have stolen anything from anyone. Diane had raised Grace alone since her husband's death 4 years earlier, building a careful, steady life around the two of them. A small house with a garden Diane tended on weekends, a routine of pancakes on Saturday mornings, a closeness between mother and daughter that had only deepened in the years since it became just the two of them, against whatever the world put in front of them. Diane's work at Meridian had never been about ambition so much as stability, a way to give Grace the kind of dependable, ordinary childhood Diane herself had not always had, growing up in a household defined by financial chaos. The night everything changed had started ordinarily enough, Diane finishing a late report at her desk when she noticed the same irregularity she had flagged weeks earlier had reappeared, larger this time, routed through an account she did not recognize. She mentioned it to her supervisor the next morning, expecting the same reassurance she had received before. Instead, 2 weeks later, company auditors arrived at her desk with police officers behind them, informing her she was under arrest for embezzlement. The very funds she had tried to report now somehow traced directly back to her own login credentials. Grace had been at school when it happened, collected instead by a neighbor, told only that her mother had been called away unexpectedly. A gentle lie that lasted exactly until Grace, 9 years old and sharper than any adult in her life gave her credit for, found the news article herself that evening. Victor Sloan had not acted alone in constructing the case against Diane, though he had been careful to ensure his own fingerprints stayed far from the visible evidence. The transactions routed through Diane's login credentials had been engineered weeks in advance by someone with direct access to Meridian's internal systems, someone positioned closely enough to Diane's own workstation to make the fabrication convincing without raising immediate suspicion among her co-workers. Prosecutor Marcus Reyes built his case in good faith, working from evidence handed to him by police investigators, who themselves had received selectively curated files from Chief Daniel Okafor, a man whose cooperation with Sloan's organization stretched back years, buried beneath a public reputation for tough, effective policing. Reyes did not know, standing confidently before the court on the day of Diane's arraignment, that the very foundation of his case had been constructed specifically to be unquestionable. Every falsified document cross-referenced and internally consistent enough to survive routine scrutiny. What no one on the prosecution's side accounted for was Diane's whereabouts on the night the largest fraudulent transaction had allegedly been executed under her credentials. A night Diane had spent entirely at Hope Medical Center's pediatric emergency room, holding Grace's hand through a frightening sudden illness that had sent her daughter's fever spiking dangerously in the middle of the night. Diane had mentioned this to her original defense attorney early on. It had, somehow, never made it into the official case file at all. The courtroom recess, Judge Cole ordered, following Grace's outburst, gave Diane's new court-appointed attorney, a careful young lawyer named Sarah Kim, exactly the window she needed to chase down what the original defense had somehow overlooked. She drove to Hope Medical Center within the hour, pulling admission records for the pediatric emergency room on the night in question. Records that confirmed precisely what Grace had shouted across a courtroom full of skeptical adults. Diane Whitfield had been logged into the hospital system at 11:40 that night and had not left until well past dawn. Nurse Helen Marsh, who had cared for Grace through that frightening night, remembered Diane clearly the moment Sarah Kim showed her the photograph. Remembered the quiet, steady way Diane had stayed by her daughter's bedside without once looking at her phone, without once stepping away even to eat, entirely present through hours that had clearly terrified her far more than she had let Grace see at the time. When Sarah brought the hospital records back to Judge Cole's chambers, requesting an emergency review, Marcus Reyes reacted exactly as a prosecutor confident in his case should, requesting to see the documentation himself, expecting some misunderstanding he could easily clear up. Instead, reading through the timestamps a second time, Reyes felt something shift uncomfortably in his stomach, a physical presence at a hospital fundamentally incompatible with transactions executed, according to his own evidence, from a company workstation at 11:50 that same night. Harrison Cole had spent 11 years believing the accident that took the use of his legs had been exactly that, a tragic mechanical failure late one night on a rain-slicked highway. He had not walked since, had not fully investigated the incident once early inquiries turned up nothing conclusive, and had, in the years since, allowed something quiet and bitter to settle into the way he presided over his courtroom, a colder version of the man he had once been, more concerned with procedure than with the deeper truths procedure sometimes failed to capture. Grace's outburst had unsettled him in a way he did not immediately understand, and it was only later that evening, reviewing his own case history from years earlier at the request of his clerk, that Cole found the thread he had never pulled. He had been investigating irregularities at a company called Meridian Corp in the months before his accident, irregularities remarkably similar to the ones now surfacing in Diane Whitfield's case. He had filed the investigation away as inconclusive after the accident sidelined him, never suspecting the two events might be connected. Reviewing old maintenance records for his vehicle that night, records he had never once thought to request in the 11 years since, Cole found a detail that had been sitting in plain sight the entire time, waiting for someone to finally look closely enough to see it. A service log inconsistency suggesting his brakes had been tampered with just days before the accident that ended his ability to walk. Sarah Kim, working alongside investigators Cole quietly assigned once he understood the scope of what they might be facing, began tracing Meridian Corp's finances further than anyone had before, uncovering a pattern stretching back nearly a decade. 15 separate cases surfaced across those years, each following an almost identical shape, a competent employee noticing financial irregularities, asking inconvenient questions, and shortly afterward finding themselves accused of crimes they had not committed, their credibility destroyed before they could meaningfully threaten the scheme they had stumbled upon. Victor Sloan had not built this alone. Councilwoman Patricia Wren had steered favorable zoning and tax legislation toward Meridian for years in exchange for campaign contributions funneled through shell companies designed specifically to obscure their origin. Chief Daniel Okafor had ensured that any investigation threatening to expose the arrangement quietly stalled, evidence misplaced, witnesses discouraged, timelines extended until public attention moved elsewhere. When word reached Sloan that Judge Cole had personally begun reviewing his own decade-old case alongside Diane Whitfield's, panic moved through the small circle of people who understood exactly what that connection could unravel if followed to its end. Marcus Reyes, increasingly uneasy about the case he had built, found himself summoned to a private meeting he did not fully understand the danger of, until he was already sitting across from men who made it very clear that his cooperation was no longer optional. Reyes spent the following days in a state of escalating dread, understanding with increasing clarity that the case he had built with what he believed was solid evidence had, in fact, been constructed around him as much as by him. He began quietly gathering his own evidence, recordings of conversations, financial records connecting Sloan, Wren, and Okafor across years of coordinated corruption, preparing something he intended to bring directly to Judge Cole once he understood how to do so safely. He never got the chance to deliver it in person. Reyes disappeared 3 days later. His apartment found empty, his car left in a parking garage downtown, his phone going straight to voicemail for the first time in the entire case. Before vanishing, he had set a scheduled email to his personal attorney, timed to send automatically unless he canceled it within 24 hours. He did not cancel it. His body was recovered from the river 2 days later, ruled a suicide by initial investigators loyal to Okafor, though the coroner assigned to the case noted physical evidence inconsistent with that conclusion, marks suggesting Reyes had been forced to write a final confession before his death, rather than choosing to write one himself. The scheduled email, containing everything Reyes had gathered, reached his attorney exactly as planned, and from there, reached Judge Cole's chambers within hours, arriving at precisely the moment the conspiracy believed it had successfully silenced its last direct threat. Judge Cole reconvened court, not merely to finalize Diane Whitfield's exoneration, but to formally confront the network Reyes's final evidence had fully exposed. Victor Sloan arrived expecting a routine formality regarding an already collapsing embezzlement case, entirely unprepared for the moment Cole called him forward alongside Councilwoman Wren and Chief Okafor, laying out years of falsified evidence, laundered campaign contributions, and buried investigations with a precision that left no room for the easy denials Sloan had clearly rehearsed on his way into the building. Witnesses Cole's investigators had quietly located over the preceding days took the stand one after another, former employees whose careers and reputations had been destroyed the same way Diane's nearly had been. Each account adding weight to a pattern too extensive and too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. When Sloan's own recorded instructions, preserved in Reyes's final evidence package, played aloud in the courtroom, confirming his direct involvement in fabricating the case against Diane, the last of his composure finally broke. Okafor attempted, briefly, to shift blame entirely onto Reyes, framing him as a lone corrupt actor rather than a participant in something far larger, until Cole calmly noted that a single prosecutor could not have orchestrated 15 years of falsified evidence across multiple departments without extensive cooperation from people positioned exactly where Okafor and Wren had been the entire time. Diane Whitfield's conviction was formally vacated that same afternoon, her handcuffs removed in front of the same courtroom that had watched her 9-year-old daughter refuse to sit down and stay quiet weeks earlier. Grace ran to her mother the moment the cuffs came off, and the sound of that reunion, quiet at first and then overwhelming, was the first sound in that courtroom all day that carried no trace of calculation or performance, only relief. Sloan, Wren, and Okafor were formally charged that same week, the full scope of their 15-year pattern of manufactured convictions becoming public record almost immediately, sparking reviews into every case connected to their network. 14 other wrongfully convicted individuals, their records cleared alongside Diane's, began the slow process of rebuilding lives interrupted years earlier by a scheme they never fully understood until it finally collapsed. Judge Harrison Cole stood, fully and without assistance, for the first time in 11 years, 3 weeks after the case closed, the tampering to his brakes finally confirmed by investigators who had, at his own insistence, reopened the decade-old accident alongside everything else. He did not call it a miracle, not in the way Grace had once promised him in the middle of a packed courtroom. He called it simply, what happens when the truth is finally allowed to reach the surface instead of being buried by people who believed themselves untouchable. What do you think? Would you have believed a 9-year-old girl making an impossible promise in the middle of a courtroom, or would you have laughed along with everyone else in that gallery? Let us know in the comments below. And if this story kept you watching until the very end, wait until you hear about our next case, a missing inheritance, a family divided by a 20-year-old secret, and a truth that refused to stay buried. Subscribe now so you never miss it, and turn on notifications so you're the first to know the moment it drops.